Hello, everybody. For the next two lectures, we are going to talk about reconstructing past disturbances. And the aim is that after these two lectures, you will have overview of different proxies that can be used to reconstruct past disturbances and what kind of methods can be used to utilize those proxies. So we are going to basically talk about sedimentary charcoal records, how to use them to reconstruct fires. Also, we are going to talk about biomarkers as indication of fire, and also non-pollen palynomorphs and insect remains and tree ring records and how those can be used to reconstruct past disturbances. And then also we are going to look how disturbances affect ecosystems and what are the implications of the knowledge of past disturbances and how those have affected in ecosystems. And just before we go further, I will just show you some current disturbances. Here in this picture, you see spruce forest after windstorm and bark beetle outbreak. So in Šumava National Park in southwestern Czech Republic. And here you can see quite waste areas where there's trees fell down and some dead trees after bark beetle outbreak. So the disturbance can have quite big effect on the landscape. And here is pine forest 1.5 months after a forest fire in Muhos. And this fire occurred this year at the end of June, and I was able to visit the area in mid-August, and it looked like this. There was some post-fire succession already starting in the ground layer, but as you can see, pretty much all trees are dead and the ground layer has burned. So the fire has quite a big effect on the landscape as well. So today we are going to concentrate on fires. So after just short introduction in general, reconstructing past disturbances, we are going to look more into fires and especially sedimentary records in reconstructing past fires. And then we are going to go through most common ways to use sedimentary records, especially sedimentary charcoal to reconstruct fire, and then also take a look about the recent developments in the field and what are the current trends. And also in this photo here, you can see forest after bark beetle outbreak around the lake surroundings and some dead trees. And also there's this little boat where it's ongoing coring from the lake sediment that is then used to assess the disturbance history in the lake surroundings. So in general, reconstructing past disturbances, what can we actually learn from the past disturbances and why do we want to reconstruct them in the first place? So basically, when we have the idea of long-term changes in the disturbance frequency and different disturbance events, we can compare the long-term history to the current disturbances, and we can say that what is natural variability in the disturbances, and if the current ongoing disturbances in, for example, fires or windstorms that are causing windrows in the forests, if they are coming more frequent or more intense, or if there's more bark beetle outbreaks at the moment. So it is important information when we are kind of looking into the ecosystems and how they are responding the changes in current environment. We can also look to the main disturbance agents if there has been changes in different disturbance events, if there's been more fires in the past, and if it's changed, if it's more of insect outbreaks, and or if the disturbance have been natural because of human impact in the landscape. Also, by combining different paleoecological proxies, for example, information from changes in climate, for example, during the Holocene, we can see, or the human activity, we can try to look what have been the drivers behind the disturbance regimes. For example, if there's been change in the fire frequency, or if there's been more bark beetle outbreaks, what may have been caused these changes? Is it because of changes in the temperature or precipitation, or if there is more human-induced fires, for example, and so on. And then we can look into the long-term effects of these disturbances on ecosystems. If we can see some traces in the forest structure, for example, or if the disturbances can change the forest structure overall after the disturbance events, after single disturbance events, or if it's needed this longer period of disturbances to make changes in the ecosystems. But these are things that when we have information for hundreds and thousands or tens of thousands or millions of years, we can get bigger, larger perspective what is happening at the moment. So I've showed this picture already before, just to bring to your mind. We can get these disturbance signals from different sedimentary archives, and those are after the disturbance occurs. The signals and the proxies that we can use to reconstruct past disturbances are transported to a sedimentary environment where they will be deposited. For example, if we have fires, we will have charcoal that is coming from the burning plant material, and then it will be transported by the wind, or then as a surface transportation with, for example, runoff, and then it will be deposited on the sedimentary archives, for example, the lake bottoms or on mires and so on. Also, if we have insect outbreaks, we can have fossil remains of insect found from the sedimentary layers when they've been carried to the site along the wind or runoff and so on. Also, we can have windrows, and usually then the indication of windrows we can have in sedimentary records. For example, if we have signal about erosion in the, for example, lake catchments, or we can look into tree ring records and maybe see changes in the growth of tree rings and make deduction with comparison of different other records that there might have been windrows. Or we can have anthropogenic disturbance indicators that is also deposited in sedimentary archives. For example, anthropogenic induced fire or grazing or other. For example, we could also have logging, although from that we don't have that much information in the sedimentary archives. But as with the, for example, when reconstructing vegetation, the taphonomy, how the proxies, for example, charcoal from fires is deposited and transported is similar to, for example, pollen and so on. So what are then, what paleoecological proxies can we use for reconstructing disturbances? Firstly, charcoal. So basically after fire events, there's charred plant material that is deposited and preserved in sediments that reflect past fires. And we can use non-pollen palynomorphs. As already in the previous lecture I mentioned, we can use these certain fungi and spores that are growing in the burnt material and need certain temperatures to germinate. Also, we can use these spores from fungi that are growing on dung, and that can be used as indicator of human impact or maybe disturbance caused by large herbivores in the forest or on the ecosystem. Then we can use fossil beetle remains, which basically, for example, in case of coniferous forest, we can look into bark beetles that can reveal past insect outbreaks. And there's been just quite recent studies showing that the amount of bark beetle remains that are found from sediments can be used to reconstruct also past bark insect outbreaks. Then we can use biomarkers, so basically different molecular structures caused by high temperatures that can be found and analyzed from sedimentary records and indicate past fires. We can also use tree rings. We can make overall disturbance reconstructions just based on the measurements of the width of the tree ring. So basically when there's a disturbance and, for example, opening in the forest, there's more nutrition and light to the trees, and then they might grow faster and have wider tree rings for that year or the years after the disturbance. Whereas then when their tree rings are more narrow, there's probably a normal period, but then when it widens, then probably there's been some event opening up the forest canopy. Then fire scars also looked from tree rings, but when there's a fire and it doesn't necessarily kill the trees, but it can harm the bark and leave a mark on the tree surface. And then if the tree doesn't die on the fire, it keeps growing, and then there can be several scars from different fires that can be then dated by counting tree rings. So these can be also used to reconstruct fire events in the forest. And then, as I already previously mentioned, we can use geochemical data and geophysical data to record the disturbances through erosion events in the site surroundings. So these are the main proxies that we are going to deal with in these lectures. There is others, but these are probably the most common ones used. So as there are different proxies, they show different kind of temporal and spatial extent and resolution. And we can use these all together or separately depending on what we want to reconstruct. First of all, the most, I would say, precise records in temporal and also in spatial resolutions are modeling and satellite imagery and documented data, but we are not going into those that much in these lectures because we are more looking into the past. Of course, these data can be also used to reconstruct disturbances further back to history, but we can then verify them and use these data to verify other proxies that can be used to reconstructive disturbances. Then we have the tree ring records that usually give quite precise information for the temporal resolution because you can analyze them, for example, in 1 year resolution when you are calculating tree rings, or you get quite precise spatial resolution because you can look into one tree or a stand of trees or forest, or then just by investigating several trees, you can expand the spatial extent. But then with the tree rings, the temporal extent, it's usually a few hundred years because of usually the trees are not older than that. And it's also quite laborious work to analyze all these tree ring records. So just by one researcher, it's not that easy to cover large areas. Then there is the lake sediment and also the peat layers and ice core records that you can have temporal resolution usually up to 10 years, or if you have barbed lake sediment you can have higher, but usually it's 10 or 100 years. But then the temporal extent, it can go to millions of years. Also with lake sediments, and then you can get maybe regional, or if you have multiple sites, continental and even global extent. And also from ice core records, you usually have quite wide spatial extent, and also quite good extent in time as well. Then you have the soil and small hollow records, where you get more local, like stand scale information of the past disturbances. So basically inside one forest stand. And then with the temporal resolution, usually these peat layers, you're not able to date quite as high resolution as, for example, lake sediments, but sometimes, rarely it's possible, but usually it's between 10 or in decadal resolution, or then 100 years of resolution. But with the sedimentary records, the same as with lake sediments and ice cores, you basically can go as deep in time as just the record covers. And then there's also marine records, which obviously you can get to more deep time. Also more regional records, as it kind of the proxies deposited on marine environments are coming from larger areas. Then we will go now more deeply into reconstructing past fires. Just to give you an idea that fires have occurred on Earth as long as there's been oxygen and biomass to burn. Obviously, there have been the ignition source as well. But from here, you can see kind of a semantic reconstruction of global fire. And we can see that there's first evidence from fires in the Earth histories from Silurian. So circa 400 million years ago. You can see the time scale here, but notice that it kind of changes when you go. It's more precise here and kind of more coarse at the end. But you can see the change, and then there's the first evidence. Then there's been a lot of biomass burning. There's been trees, terrestrial plants, more fires, and then there's been increase in burning around the onset of Holocene, so around when the humans started to more maybe utilize fire in more systematic manner. So we can see increase in the global fire, and then there's been this some changes, and then there's indications of global warming and probably increasing fires. But you can see that the fire has been part of Earth systems since or hundreds of millions of years. Here, just to show you the kind of the first steps of fire on Earth. These have been studied from sedimentary rocks and also ice cores extending further deep in time. But here we can again see in Silurian there's the first evidence of fire. You can check the same time that there's the evolution and development of the vegetation. There's earliest vascular plants just before the evidence of fire. Then there's first forests, again tropical mires. There's starting to be more common fires before the forest, and developing there were just more of rare fires. But then when there's more and more biomass to burn, there's also more fire activity around the globe. Then we already looked at the different proxies for reconstructing disturbances in general, and then their temporal and spatial extent and resolution. So here is a little bit similar information, but just for reconstructing fire and different proxies for reconstructing fire. So here also the fire scars, they are the most precise temporally, but doesn't extend that far. Also spatial resolution is quite good in local and instant scale. Then we have the charcoal in lake sediments and peat bogs, and again we get the decadal centennial resolution. Quite rarely we can get yearly resolution, but most commonly decadal resolution, and the extent of the records goes to millions of years. Then we have charcoal and black carbon in marine environments, and we can get further back in time. The oldest fires can be studied from sedimentary rocks and giving quite large spatial resolution. Then we have the chemical markers and black carbon from ice cores, where we get quite good extent of the fire record. Also pollen-based fire history, and then charcoal and black carbon in soils, and we can get quite good extent, but then not as good spatial or temporal resolution, but then better spatial resolution. Also, it depends if there's only a single sample, and for example with fire scars, we can get only with single sample, we can get quite reliable information that fire's been present. But usually then for the other proxies, you need for wider reconstruction, you need more records, and as with the fire scars as well. But usually the kind of the extent or the spatial resolution is not as good as with charcoals, fire scars or charcoals in the soils. And this means this kind of charcoal layers that you know that are not transported with wind or anything, but gives indication of local fires. So depending of what we want to research and what are the research questions, we can choose a proxy which we can use to reconstruct past fires. And why do we then want to reconstruct past fires? We know that fire has important role in ecosystems over the globe, and especially in boreal forest, fire is considered as one of the most natural disturbance factors that is shaping and keeping the mosaic structure and diversity of boreal forest. And also, while the climate warming and predicted rising temperatures, also the fire risk and has been predicted to increase. So it's also important to know how fires have impacted on ecosystems in the past. Also, fire can have different impacts depending of the intensity or the type of the fire. If it's a ground fire, which usually occurs in spruce forest and destroys the whole forest stand, or it can be also ground fire, usually a surface fire, usually more in pine forest and less severe. And after this ground fires, the trees can be left alive and maybe not that big destruction on the vegetation as after intensive ground fires. And depending on what kind of fire occurs, the fire can change the vegetation composition and structure, and it can be very short-term changes, and there can be succession back to the previous forest composition and structure, or there can be long-term changes and it can completely change the forest composition at the site of the fire. And usually these effects of fire on ecosystem can be assessed when proxies reconstructing fires are used together with pollen. So then we can see the occurrence of fire and then how it may have affected the vegetation in the breath from the pollen records. So usually they are studied together to get this kind of a big picture. So then when talking about fires, the important concept is fire regime, and it kind of determines the effect and how the ecosystem will respond. So I already talked about the fire type. So if it's above ground, below ground, or in the canopy. Also the fire intensity, usually, so the more higher temperatures the fire burns, more destructivities, and usually the ground fires, they burn in higher temperatures than, for example, the surface fires. Also the fire severity, like how much of the organic matter is consumed on the fire. So how big amount of biomass is burning during the fire. And then also fire frequency. So basically how often fires happen per given time. And here in the figure, you can see this is kind of this conceptual figure of the temporal and spatial scale of the factors that affect fire and determining kind of the scale of the fire. So basically when we are in the scale of days or even seconds or hours, and in very kind of local scale in just in one place, we may just have like a flame, or that can be then basically affected by oxygen, heat, and fuel. So just the factors that can bring the fire on. Then when we go further on the scale, we can have fire event, and then it is kind of affected by weather and fuel. So basically the material that there is to burn, and it can have local or landscape level controls like topography or moisture conditions, and that may affect how the fire is and how the fire event is and what kind of effect it has on ecosystems. Then when we are at the level of fire regime, so in this landscape level that have these factors like that are repeated in cycles, there's the fire type, fire intensity, fire frequency, and those then are affected by climate, vegetation, and then also this landscape controls that is affecting to the occurrence of fire. And now there's more and more talk about this, that there should be these super fire regimes that is looking at the long-term climatic variations and if we see some long-term periods and changes in the fire regime. For example, if there is really great increase now in fire frequency because of the changing climate and so on. So here is also this, usually when talking about fire history and how the fire is seen and how it's affecting the ecosystems, there's this broad term fire regime, which is good to kind of know what it entails. So then going further towards the actual reconstructions of the fires. So it's been quite early, already 1940s, that the Iversen studied or presented first these charcoal-based fire signals, studied from the sedimentary charcoals together from pollen studies. And it took some decades that his methods was further adapted, and there started to be more or some research using these sedimentary charcoals together from counted with pollen. So counting microscopic charcoal in 60s and 70s. And then in the 90s, there was clear increase in these fire studies based on sedimentary charcoal. And you can see from this figure that they plotted the published number of published papers that have charcoal or paleo in their name or in the abstract or in the keywords. And we can see here that from this, there's some published papers in the 80s and towards the late 80s, but then from the start of the 90s, there starts to be more of these publications. And then when we come to the 21st century, we can see a clear and sharp increase. So there's been clear interest in reconstructing fires, and with increasing amounts of fires happening all over the globe, there's more and more numbers of fire research coming out and published in scientific journals. So it's really a growing field and developing field of science. So what is it then based on that we can reconstruct fires from sedimentary charcoal records? So basically when plant material is burning, it usually, there's parts of the plants that produce charcoal by incomplete combustion. So basically during the fire event, the incomplete burning of the plants produce these charcoal particles, and this charred plant material is then deposited in and preserved in the sediments. And as I already previously said, the size of the fire, how intense the fire is affecting how the fire is deposited and transported. For example, if you have very intense ground fire, it can lift the smoke and also the charcoal particles quite high in the atmosphere, that is then transported further away from the fire. But then, for example, if we have ground or surface fires, usually staying below the canopy level, usually then it leaves more local signal and is not transported that far. And we can study microscopic and macroscopic charcoal in sediments that are reflecting fires. And by microscopic charcoal, it's usually referred to charcoal that is analyzed together from pollen slides. And then macroscopic charcoal is usually bigger fragments in the sediments. And the fire is interpreted in the peak in the charcoal record, so you usually always have some background charcoal, but you can, for example, here is a charcoal record from microscopic charcoal, and there's some very clear peaks on the charcoal record that actually can be then combined with these layers in the peat profile and can be quite reliable in indicating past fires on the site. So this is the principle of reconstructing or using the sedimentary charcoal records. So then looking into microscopic charcoal, they are usually considered to be smaller than 150 microns, and as already said, usually analyzed from pollen slides together with the analysis of the pollen types. And for example, here you can see some charcoal particles on the pollen slides. And usually microscopic charcoal is considered as indication of regional fires, because usually these smaller particles are easier to lift it to the air and transport it by wind and longer distances from the actual site of the fire, and usually considered, especially if studied from lakes and big open mires, usually considered to reflect regional fires. But also microscopic charcoal, if studied from the small hollow sites, can give signal of the local fires. So just example of reconstruction of regional fires from microscopic charcoal records. Here is 4 charcoal records, microscopic charcoal records from 4 lakes from southern Finland. And from there we can see changes in the amount of the charcoal particles, and we can see increase around the 1000 or 1500 years ago, which is related to the increased human impact and increased human-induced fire in southern Finland. And this regional fire reconstruction kind of tracks the fire record or the fire reconstruction for the whole Fennoscandia when compared to other studies. So this kind of gives the regional signal. But then when we compared still microscopic charcoal records from small hollows, these are microscopic charcoal record from 3 small hollow records, so should show local fire history, and we can see that there is quite different indication of different fire histories between these sites. And for example, Larix Hollow and Mosquito Hollow, these sites, they are only less than 1 kilometer apart, but separated by a lake and a land bridge or esker. So we can see that the topographical and other landscape scale controls can affect the fire regime and can be recorded in these small hollow sites. So when we compare this, we can see that in this Mosquito Hollow, there's almost no indication of fires, whereas then there is clear peaks in Larix Hollow indicating that there's been fires on the site. Olka Hollow is a little bit further down the south, but also there we can see some distinctive peaks, probably indicating local fires. But in general, microscopic charcoal is considered to reflect regional fires. Then macroscopic charcoal, so basically bigger than 150 microns. And usually the samples for macroscopic analysis, they try to be prepared carefully so that the charcoal particles wouldn't break, and also usually sieved so that all the smaller material is sieved through, and then it's left with these macroscopic charcoals. And these macroscopic charcoals are considered to reflect local fire events and fire on or around the sample site. So basically, there's also different ways to analyze macroscopic charcoal. Usual ways is to count macroscopic particles per certain amount of sediment sample, or then also the area of the charcoal can be measured per volume, or for example 1 square centimeter. And usually when analyzed by counts, it's or area, the charcoal particles can be classified by size. And for example, when measuring the charcoal particles, if there's particles over 1 millimeter in size, it's very probable that it's from local fire. For example, here there's some pictures from sediment samples from small records from central Finland, and here the scale is 1 millimeter. So you can see that there's very different sizes of charcoals, but there's, for example, this particle that it's over 1 millimeter and probably indication of local fire. Also, when looking at the macroscopic charcoal, they can have different kind of morphological features that can be used to interpret what kind of material can have actually been burned. As I said, both the charcoal number or the count and also the charcoal surface area from the sediment samples are analyzed, and they give more or less similar results. Sometimes the counts can a little bit represent the fires, because if you have bigger particles that are breaking, then you would have higher counts because of the breakage of the charcoal particles. But then when you have the charcoal area, or so the surface area, you're basically just counting together all the charcoal that you have in the sample. So then it doesn't really matter if the charcoal breaks, because you will get anyway the overall surface area. But for example, here there's a study from northern Canada, in Canada, in North America. So there's you can see that the red is a number of charcoal, so the counts, and then the blue is the surface area. And here we can see that that usually the count is showing a little bit bigger peak, but usually when there's more charcoal in counted numbers, there's also peak in the charcoal area. So it seems that both of them gives quite good indication if there's been fire event in the area. Another comparison now with the microscopic and macroscopic charcoal records. Basically, in the upper panel here, there's a fire reconstruction based on macroscopic charcoal records, and then in the lower panel, there's a record of microscopic charcoal records. And with the macroscopic charcoal record, we get indication of more local fire, and when compared to microscopic charcoal record, giving indication of regional fire, we see that maybe in the area of this study, in the surrounding regional scale, there's been some fire events, especially here, that is not recorded in the local charcoal record. So this suggests that probably in the area there's been fires, but the fire has not reached this sampled site, at least in high numbers. And just here we can then see that there's a local fire that is not reflected in the regional charcoal record. So basically there's indication of local fire. And well, here we can see that there's indication of regional and local fire events in these both records. And also in this study, there's the comparison of count and also charcoal area. So here the blue dots are indicating peaks in charcoal record when the area is analyzed, and then from macroscopic charcoal record, and then this red gray dot is indicating a peak based on charcoal counts. So here we can see that they are a little bit different, but on most places they record quite well the peaks in charcoal, giving indication of the fire event on the site. So this way you can use kind of different ways to the sedimentary charcoal records to complement each other and get more reliable record. This is another example where you can see the regional fires indicated by microscopic charcoal, and then more pronounced local fires represented by macro charcoal. And here this residual means that they've taken out the kind of the residual between kind of this background charcoal level and the difference to the peaks. So it kind of indicates the fire events, all these peaks. And we can see that there's, especially towards the modern time, there's clear increase in the fire events in both local and regional scale. And also they've compared pollen. So epilobium is a type that grows quite shortly after fires on the burnt site. It's kind of a pioneer species, in English fireweed and in Finnish maitohorsma. So basically you see a lot of those after fires, and so there's also increase of epilobium pollen simultaneously to fires. So it's kind of good indication of fire activity. What is interesting here is that in local record doesn't show any fires between 7,000 and 6,000 years, whereas in local fire record and also in local in regional fire record and also in the record of epilobium pollen you see indication of fire events on that time, which is quite interesting result. But again, these all these proxies, they are kind of complementing each other. Then there's one more example about fire history using both microscopic and macroscopic charcoal influx. And here we can again see that they go quite well together. There's been in the region, there's been fires also from this peatbog. They've found this low indication of local fires, and we can see that these fires kind of go together with the indicators of primary anthropogenic pollen taxa. So basically meaning cultivated plants, or then there's other plants benefiting from the human presence, and those are secondary anthropogenic indicators. And also there you see peaks coming after fire or when there's increase in fires. So again, by combining proxies, you get kind of more comprehensive view from the environment. Yeah, so here you can see the microscopic charcoal influx and here macroscopic charcoal influx. Then I've been mentioned a few times that the peaks in the charcoal records are the indication that there's been fire event, and to actually analyze this and assess this statistically, Philip Higuera have developed this software or program called char analysis, and it can be used to detect the peaks that are significantly different from the background charcoal and can be held as an indication of local fire event. And in this char analysis, they are calculating this background level for the charcoal record using different kind of time windows and smoothing the data, and then using this signal to noise index, which basically singles out the amount or the peak going above the background level, and then determines that as a significant peak, and then gives indication of the local fire event. And in these examples, you can see that the charcoal record, basically PCs per the charcoal influx values. And then here is the background charcoal record, and then there's the peaks. And then you have that kind of the marks here where the char analysis have singled out these peaks that are then these significant peaks and can be inferred as local fire events. Here is one example using char analysis. They basically used microscopic charcoal counts, then they have macroscopic charcoal counts, and they have macroscopic charcoal area. And then they have here the background values. They've calculated the signal to noise index to determine the background values and the peaks, differentiating from the background. So this is basically the data. And then here are the residuals between the background charcoals and the peaks, and then the significant peaks that are coming from the threshold defined by the signal to noise index. So basically here we can see the significant fire peaks for macroscopic area and for macroscopic counts, and they go quite well together, and also the microscopic charcoal counts. So we can see the significant peaks are more or less coinciding on these records. So this is also one way of using this software. And here another example. This is a fire history reconstruction from Sumava National Park in Czechia. And here also they've analyzed microscopic charcoal as just a comparison. Then there's the charcoal area. You have the charcoal influx and the background values. And again, you have the significant fire events. Here is the count data, and again significant fire events, and then they've determined the fire frequency based on the peaks and how frequently the significant fire events are reoccurring. So basically here you can see that this is peaks per 1,000 years, and this indicates that here there's been 6 fires within 1,000 years, so the fire frequency have been 6 fires per 1,000 years, and higher than, for example, here. And again, then here there is more higher fire frequency. Now, based on the counts and the area, there is pretty similar trends, but then there is some differences there. And then also there's the peak magnitude that is measured from the residuals, and it's kind of showing what it's it can be used as indication of the severity of the fire in the fire record. So also a way to use char analysis. Then some current and developing trends analyzing past fires from sedimentary records. So basically using microscopic and macroscopic charcoal to assess the fire frequency and the fire return interval, how often fires happened, when there was more intensive periods of fires and so on. Those being the more traditional ways of reconstructing past fire history. But in recent years, there's been, in recent decades, let's say, there's been more and more efforts to reconstruct also different aspects of the fire regime, which is beyond the fire frequency and fire return interval. So basically the type of the fire, what has been burned, reconstructed from charcoal morphologies or biomarkers. And then also they tried to find ways to reconstruct fire intensity. So basically the combustion temperature of our charcoal records, also to assess the fire severity. So basically the area of fire and impact on wet ecosystems. And then there's also more and more charcoal-based studies and studies to reconstruct fire, as I showed in the beginning, the kind of the increase in charcoal research. So there's more and more data, and there are these charcoal databases that can be used to then synthesize data from many sites, and you can make regional or global analyses and have global scale research questions. So kind of aim to bigger, and when you have more sites, you also have more reliable results even from one region. And then also, as with the reconstructing vegetation, also with reconstructing disturbances, there is efforts to use the past information to understand what is happened currently and also what might be happening in the future, and how the disturbance regimes might change under the changing conditions and how they might affect the ecosystems. So firstly, the efforts to look into what have been burned. So from microscopic charcoal records can be also analyzed the morphology of the charcoal particles, and you can identify if the burned material have been wood or grasses or so on. And this morphology can reveal the type of burnt material, in the sense also the type of fire, if you have had more grasses from surface fires or wood material or conifer needles and so on. And this can be then used to determine what have been burned and how severe maybe the fire have been. So there's been efforts to determine which kind of morphological features different materials leave, and there's been comparison of charcoal produced in laboratory and compared to charcoals from the sedimentary records. So basically you can see that you can see a bit similar features. For example, there's charcoal from lake sediments here, and then there's charcoal from burned spruce and pine species that are burned in laboratory, and then you can compare these figures. And then also here, this is oak leaves from sedimentary records and then burned in laboratory, and you can see some resemblance. And then, for example, if you see this type of charcoal particles in the in your sediment samples, you can quite well see that they are different, and other one is from conifers and other one from broadleaf trees. So then you can have idea how these what have been burned in the area. this is example of charcoal particles studied from sedimentary records from lake sediment record in Latvia, and they differentiated 5 different classes that they've separated to charcoal. So basically they have roots, wood material, herbaceous plant material, and just leaves, primarily from broadleaf forest, and this is so basically deciduous forest, and then also some grasses that you can identify from the record. And based on this morphological identification of the charcoal samples, they've made these reconstructions showing here the peak magnitude of the charcoal record in general, indicating that there's been, for example, fires here and here and here and so on. And then this thinner line is indicating the kind of the amount of the charcoal particles with morphological features for herbs or boissy or leaves or wood. And then you have here the reveals corrected vegetation cover for herbs and for boissy temperature cover, and also boreal tree cover. And this black line is for the kind of the total tree cover, and the green one is for basically conifer and boreal trees, and this is the temperate tree cover. So we can see from here that this kind of the burnt material kind of goes quite well together with the amount of the also the reconstructed vegetation cover. And also you can see that there's more burning. This is just a temperate tree cover here, while here we can see more burning grasses and so on. So then by using these morphologies, they've been able to make reconstructions what kind of vegetation have been actually burning in the area. Then going to a little bit different proxy for past fires. So one of the recent developments is also to use these molecular characteristics in the sediments. So basically when biomass is burning in different sources, they produce this kind of a characteristic organic biomarkers, and those include these monosaccharide anhydrides, and those can be preserved in the environments, both in marine and terrestrial sediments, and also recorded in ice cores. And then those can be used to reconstruct past fire events, and different kind of plants have and temperatures. They produce different kind of print of the biomarkers in the charcoal, in the sediment, and can be used to then kind of detect what have been burned and so on. And from these biomarkers, this monosaccharide called levoglucosan is most used and suitable because it has high amounts in the sediments, and also stays long before in the sediments, so can be used to also look into quite far in the past. And usually these are produced in the combustion temperatures around 250 to 300 Celsius degrees. So usually the same kind of temperatures that this kind of, let's say, ground fires or have been burning. So can be used to determine the different types of vegetation. When then in these chemical compounds are compared between each other and seeing the relative amounts of this levoglucosan and its isomers. So these chemical compositions can be used to determine the fire types. And here are a few examples. This is first from ice core taken from Greenland. And here is the profile of levoglucosan, and here is carbon and black carbon from burnings. And here they've marked the age of, or the timing of these peaks that are common between this levoglucosan and black carbon. So we can see that we can detect these peaks, these fire peaks, or the peaks indicating biomass burning with the levoglucosan from these ice cores. So basically they travel in the atmosphere quite far. Here is another example showing the Holocene fire history recorded in biomarkers and in charcoal records. So here first there's this reconstruction based on charcoal counts and charcoal morphologies differentiating charcoal from grasses and also charcoal from wood material. And then there's a total organic carbon in the sediments measured, which goes quite well together with the charcoal record in itself. And then also there's the biomarker record. So there's levoglucosan and also its different isomers. And we can see that it goes quite well together with the charcoal or with the fire record and history recorded from the sedimentary charcoal. So we can see quite well that these different proxies, so basically sedimentary charcoal and these molecular signals go together and can be reconstructed, can be used to reconstruct past fire history. Then there's also a different way of using chemical signals in charcoal to reconstruct, especially the kind of the combustion temperature, which is then can be used as a parameter of the fire intensity. Also now going further with the methods and analyzing the sediment and sedimentary charcoal in order to achieve a reconstruction of one of the parameters in fire regime concept. And basically when the material is burning, depending of the temperature that it is burning, it forms a certain type of composition of different chemicals like water, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and methane in the charcoal. And this can be then measured by using this kind of Fourier transformed infrared spectroscopy. So basically measure the reflectance and the spectral reflectance of the charcoal particles, and measuring these different signals and relative signals of these different chemicals, and then from this signal can be used to reconstruct the temperature of when the plant material have been burned, and then there they can do some interpretation of the possible intensity of the fires, because typically it is known that these high intensity ground fires that can burn the whole forest stand at the forest floor, they burn in about temperatures with 700 degrees. Whereas then when we have these ground fires burning just a lower intensity, not killing all the trees necessarily. They usually reach circa 200 degrees. And then when we would have this kind of slash and burn agricultural techniques, they are typically associated with fires below 400 degrees. So then when we are able to infer the temperature by looking into the chemical composition of charcoal, we can get some kind of idea how high intensity or low intensity the reconstructed fires were burning. And this is just a kind of ongoing development. And just last year, there was a paper published by Kosling et al. I think in Netherlands. They made in the laboratory, they made these experiments where they burned plant material from certain species in laboratory conditions in different kind of temperatures. So they had this low, medium, and high temperature fires, low between 200 and 300 degrees, medium between 400 and 600 degrees, and high between 600 and 700 degrees. And then they measured the spectral from those charcoal fragments. And then they also obtained sedimentary fossil charcoal fragments and measured also those with the infrared spectroscopy, and then compared those results. And from here, you can see the spectral analysis showing the different colors, so the different temperatures of the different classes and the samples that they used. So basically, in the lab, they burned the kind of the reference samples in 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, and 700 degrees. And then from those spectra, they compared the spectra that they measured from the sedimentary charcoal, which is here presented in black curves. And you can see that then kind of make the inference that the closer it follows certain kind of spectra measured from certain temperatures. Like here, it seems to follow more the higher measurements here. So we can do some kind of interpretation that what kind of fire it was. And then, of course, combined with pollen records or charcoal morphology, this can then give more comprehensive reconstruction of the past fire regime. So this is one development. Then there is also these studies done from bigger data sets, and there's more and more fires downloaded to this global paleofire database that can be used to make this bigger analysis. And for example, there is one example of this kind of a global biomass burning reconstruction for the past 22,000 years for the whole globe. So basically here we can see the increase in biomass burning, this kind of a summary curve. Also then in northern latitudes, in tropics, and then southern latitudes. And we can see that there's this trend of increasing biomass burning towards the modern times. During the last glaciation, especially in northern areas, the biomass burning was low because most of the northern areas were covered by ice, but we can see quite steady increase, and especially during the last 500 years, there's been clear increase in the fires. And also here, this is showing the kind of the anomaly from this average value, which is calculated from pre-industrial times. So the base period is from 21,000 years to 200 years ago. And from this kind of base value, they've calculated for each time window the difference from this base value. And if it's red or orange, it means that it's more fires than the base value, and if it's blue, it's less fires than the base value. And we can see from here that about 20,000 years ago there seems to have been less fires, but during the last 1,000 years it seems that there's been more fires, some of the parts of the globe. So this is one way of using big data sets. Then just zooming a little bit closer to home, here is a reconstruction of fire activity in Scandinavia during Holocene. And again here, red one shows the increase in fire activity in biomass burning, and then blue is showing more negative. So here we can see decrease of fires during the mid-Holocene or so, and then clear increase towards the present from 3,000 to about 1,000 years ago or 700 years ago, when there was a human impact and also increasing burning of forest for cultivation and so on. We can see increase, and then a little bit of change here especially in southwestern Finland and in southern Scandinavia, when the kind of the cultivation had already shifted to field cultivation, and the role of slash and burn cultivation wasn't so big anymore. Except in eastern Finland, you can see that these indicate more fires, and it kind of goes well with that in eastern Finland the slash and burn cultivation kind of lasted longer than in the southwestern Finland. So this is one way of using charcoal records. Also this example showing composite curves. This is northern boreal sector giving indication of North America, compiled with several charcoal records. This is from northern European boreal sector, so basically sites from this boreal Europe. And then this is an example for Fennoscandia, and these composite curves have been constructed from several sites and showing the charcoal influx, and this is the confidence intervals and these kind of averaged values. And here we can see again there is this increase in fire record towards the present in these sites, and early Holocene less fires, and then during the warm period peak in fires, and so one example. And then just one more example from using several sites. So this study have used charcoal records from 42 lakes to make this interpolated maps showing fire return interval. So basically for different kind of time slots, and this color shows the fire return interval, basically meaning when there's orange or reddish color, it means that there's fires more often, basically every 100 years when it's the red color. And then this bluish color, most blue, it means that is fires every 400 years, so not that often. But we can see here a change from a little bit less frequent fires towards more frequent fires around, or let's say between 5,000 to 2,000 or 3,000 years, and then there's a decrease in fire return interval and a decrease in the number of fires interpolated from these systems. So this is one way of using this kind of a charcoal records to make reconstruction of past fire activity. Then also there's more and more efforts to predict future fire activity. There's different kind of models that try to include the drivers of fires and interaction between vegetation and fire, and also mechanisms how fires and climate and vegetation interacts. And then they are tried to use to make the simulations of future fires. But it's also quite tricky because mostly these fire predictions are based on the climatic parameters and then would need more proxy records to actually verify these model simulations based on climatic parameters and so on. So there is a kind of developing field, and more when we have increasing temperatures and predicted increase also of fires following these increasing temperatures, there's these efforts to create this as reliable simulations of future fires as possible. So this was today's topics, and just as a summary, the main points is that we can reconstruct past disturbances using different kind of records and proxies in different temporal and spatial scales. It's important to remember that although quite a vast amount of the research, for example, for fire is concentrated on Holocene or Quaternary, there's been fire on the Earth systems as long as there's been biomass to burn and oxygen for the burning to happen. And then from the past fires have been most common way to reconstruct past fires have been microscopic and macroscopic charcoals from sedimentary records, and especially to reconstruct fire frequency and so how often fires have occurred. Recent decades, let's say the charcoal morphologies and biomarkers have been started to use to determine what has been burning. So basically the type of the fire, also some increase in efforts to reconstruct fire intensity and severity, and then also trend going from single sites and local fire reconstruction towards more global patterns and understanding what drives the global fire cycles and how probably we could estimate the future fires and future fire regimes. So this was everything for this lecture. We will have again online tutorial on Wednesday at 2 o'clock. You will get the assignment instructions for this relating to this lecture. You have possibility to ask questions about the assignment or topics relating to today's lecture. If there was something unclear or you want to ask more or discuss, we can do that on Wednesday. And then the next lecture, we will look into more different records than sedimentary charcoal. We will look into non-pollen polynomorphs, tree rings, also look a bit how to reconstruct past insect outbreak falls from fossil insect remains, and then touch a little bit of the effect of fire and other disturbances on ecosystems and what kind of implications we can have from the knowledge of past disturbances. So I hope to see you on Wednesday, and thank you for now.